Yes, my people. It's your boy Beej,
It's your boy Seb.
I'm Aaliyah.
and you're tuning in for another episode of Blocks of Bags. As you guys know, we have been on a run. We have been trying to chop up as much content for you guys as possible, giving you guys all the gems you need for 2024. We're that podcast where you can get all your gems around creator, entrepreneurship, and investment. Seb, what are we going to be discussing in this episode? Because we got a guest.
We've got a very, very, very special guest.
But we got to introduce him. I want you to do the full intro, and I might give him the block intro.
The full intro. So we've got a special guest here today, Dan Tsu. He is an event producer, a promoter, creative director, educator, poet, DJ. He's also the founder of Lyrix Organix, a live events and education company using rap, poetry, music, and cross-disciplinary approaches to amplify social action. He's also the co-founder of Glastonbury festival venue Rum Shack, which he has been running for over 10 years. He's worked with artists such as Ed Sheeran, Akala, Lowkey, Koji Radical. The list goes on and on and on. He's an absolute legend in the game. Everyone welcome Dan.
Yes, Dan.
Yo, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you guys. Thank you.
So picture the scene. BJ is 19 years old. He's working with an artist, Coriana Witt Johnson. Amazing artist. Mobo nominated. We're managing her. I'm jumping on this call. This guy called Dan. He's like, yeah. So, we're going to need to get sound checks. And he's setting up this whole play for us. And he's just telling us that, she's one of the alumni. Can we get her in? And I'm working with other co-founders who are like, no, this is the new price. And he's like, no, man, we know Ayana. Let's just make it all happen. I'm like, yeah, okay, cool, let's do it. I talked to the boys, we got it done. Didn't have the context. But when I think about some things that loads of young Londoners have gone through at school, those of us born in the 90s, I think Dan's work and footprint has been effective. So the story of Ayana, she went and did a jazz cafe gig that he promoted, and I was like, damn, that's my first time shaking the man's hand that I knew of. And then years later we met, and he put 1-to-1 after.
Yeah.
But the other thing I thought that was interesting about Dan's story was, you mentioned the Lowkey, the Akalas, but then you got to think about your Benjamins, the Fanayas, Lyrix Organix. There's a lot of beatbox culture and, sound and people performing in these grassroots environments. And there's been a lot of work done alongside companies like Hip Hop Shakespeare and others in doing stuff in schools. And I know many of my friends have been in workshops where poets, artists have come into schools, and you've played a massive role in that. So
Thanks,
I want to give you your flowers for that, man.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, man, we go back. So yeah, when we kind of reconnected, I don't know, about a year ago, or a year and a half ago at a Roundhouse, it was both a pleasant surprise and a blessing, because, we all come back round, good people find good people, and we're always in the same circles. So it's just good to be here and see your journey as well, bruv. Do you know what I mean? It's inspiring.
Thank you.
All of you.
So Dan, you have done many different things. You've toured the world with artists. You've also taken your business to do really interesting things in different environments. There's obviously so many elements to you. And I was on my friend Shauna's podcast earlier this week, who Seb knows in a whole different way, in a whole different way. And she was talking about this whole concept of, having multidisciplinaries, essentially.
Yeah.
There's something beautiful about having many ways to get to the bag. This is a show where we're not talking about being a jack of all trades. We're talking about different ways to get to the bag. And there's been a culture of independence, ownership, people understanding what their masters mean, people understanding what it means to actually get paid what you're worth. When I ask you the question around equity, ownership, and independence for Dan, what do those words mean to you in 2023?
I think ownership is so important in the music industry. It's a hierarchical industry which is built against us. It is an industry. I got into music because I love music, and that has always been the kind of underlying ethos behind everything that I do. And so ownership, particularly in the music industry, when you talk about licensing, when you talk about royalties, when you talk about gigs, and you talk about, the thin economy that exists within live music and the music industry as a whole, it's hard out there. And so for me, I feel a responsibility to own that space, to show people that there is a way to do things and follow your dreams and work within the community and the scene that you want to, and create change without it necessarily having to be sidelined by kind of mainstream economics or all of the politics that comes with not only the music industry, but the education sector and, you know, the charity sector as well. You know, all of these are complex spaces with their own kind of nuances. But for me, independence is about following your heart. And it sounds a bit fluffy, but truthfully, like, it hasn't served me wrong so far. You know, like, for example, working with Ayana back in the day, you know, Ayana was just like anyone else, like, you know, a struggling independent artist who believed in their work and were clearly outstanding. But there is a gap between the ambition and talent and the opportunities that are afforded to those with that talent. And so my responsibility in life, I feel like, is to bridge that gap for people, is to unlock doors for people. And that for me is independence, to pass on that independence to other people.
I love that. And one of the really interesting things I found about you, especially when I was working with you at Roundhouse, is you were running an accelerator, UMB, where you guys were running an accelerator for creators, musicians. When it comes to getting to the bag with music and artists, like, what are like the top 3 things that artists need to know about to help them in 2024?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think first is about the craft, because I think a lot of people see live performance as kind of a manifestation of their music, but it's more than that. There's value attached to those live performances. And in the time that I've been in the music industry for 15, 20 years, that has changed, where your primary source of income would be through royalties and, you know, selling CDs or whatever it might be, or merchandise. But now that's changed, and artists own that space more. Record companies understand, you know, kind of since the advent of the 360 deal, people start to understand that actually it's the artist that drives the value and the income, and all the peripheral kind of nodes that are part of that ecosystem, record labels, artist managers, agents, venues, promoters, are all there to serve the artist. And finally, it feels like we're getting to a place where it's actually putting artists at the core of that. But, you know, there's still a lot of work to do. You know, you can look at Spotify, and Spotify are amazing, but they'll be the first to say that they, you know, have a challenge with regards to recompensing artists. And they're doing good work in that space. But, you know, there's always more to be done, likewise with, you know, other major kind of media organizations. So I guess part of that is understanding the value and the worth in live music, and that in of itself is a job and a career and something where you can drive income from outside of sales, in inverted commas. Second thing would be to understand the importance of media in that kind of space, that you can now commoditize and drive income from that, obviously, in terms of, you know, advertising revenue, but also everything that kind of feeds back into your profile as an artist. So media, live. And I guess the third thing is for musicians to understand themselves as businesses. That doesn't happen as often as it should do. I would say with the communities that we work with, like, it takes a while for people to work that out. Now, if you were a visual artist or if you were a filmmaker, those are industries where the output is inherently tied to generating revenue or raising funds. Whereas in music, there is both the assumption and the kind of organic kind of process where you make music because you make music, right? If you want to release a film, like, you know, it's going to cost you thousands of pounds to get to, you know, even like 0.0. Whereas with music, you can get in your bedroom, record it, release it. And so therefore, as a result, a lot of artists think of the business stuff second. And I think there's a lot that can be done around, music business. And that what we were doing at Roundhouse together, Bejay, was working with people in the music industry at the Roundhouse to make them think of themselves as a brand and a business.
Absolutely. Last week's episode that we had was with Jams, who's just done a tape with Elijah.
Nice.
I've followed his career for quite some time, and I think the way he moves and he thinks about, evolving the grime scene and packaging up his work and just making a living is quite fascinating. He's even going down and doing stuff in Brazil. Now he went there and did some stuff at Boiler Room, and he's gone on tour there. So thinking of different pockets of ways to still stick to your craft and to your passion, even if your domestic market you're growing up in is not thriving like it once was, but finding new ways to still stick to your core but expose it to new audiences. And I think that collaboration between him and Elijah is quite interesting. Someone I know you put on to do a self-made just after our self-made, and I mean, you're worthy of a self-made yourself. So
Thanks.
this is your blockumentary right now with us.
Nice.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences of going international and doing business?
Yeah.
And the lessons you've learned that you think people should think about, especially those coming from the creative arts. So it doesn't have to just be, if you're a musician listening right now, you could be a touring business, a merch business, education, you do programs as well.
Yep.
But what lessons have you learned from selling stuff internationally? And do you have a bit of a cheat sheet or a bit of a couple of like a non-negotiable list of things that you think about before you go and set up stops in Mexico or Paris or whatever?
Yeah, that's interesting. So we've been doing a lot of work in Mexico recently. We've also worked around the world in Cuba, in Ukraine, in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, been to Russia, done stuff in Ethiopia and Sudan. A lot of those have been kind of education programs. So they haven't been out and out commercial stuff necessarily. But what's interesting, so the root of that is I've done a lot of work with British Council where I would go to emerging creative economies, places where their music industry or their events industry or their media industry is kind of developing as a reflection of the growth of the country economically anyway. And so I've effectively would go and teach kind of music business or event management or things like that in these countries. And it's interesting because I look at it from both sides. On the one hand, it's like appraising it from an educational perspective and be like, okay, well, what have you got? What's happening now? And what lessons can you learn from the way that we do things without making that horrible assumption of this is better, this is a better way of doing things, because that's not true at all, because you have to recognize the culture and everything is different in those kind of micro environments. I mean, micro in a world sense, like, in places where they have different ideas, different economic structures, different politics, things you can say, things you can't say is important in creative economies. But what has then happened is through those connections that we build whilst we're there, because often we're teaching the people putting on the biggest events, the biggest festivals, who are like running the biggest record labels and that, is that those then bring those kind of relationships. Mm-hmm. And so there's something quite organic about that, which has been really nice, which reflects what we've been doing in the UK. Like our relationships are built really organically through conversations and hanging out and, them showing me their city or them coming over here and us showing them how things run here. But in terms, when things kind of get to their next stage and it feels like we're going to run stuff, like at the moment, we've been running the Mexican Beatbox Championships. We've been doing stuff with Bajadora, which is an amazing festival.
Wait. You can't just say something like that on the show and just gloss over it.
Casual.
We've been running the Mexican Beatbox Championship.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's about the people who are there and them empowering them to do things which they didn't otherwise think they could do. So in the case of the Mexican Beatbox Championships, I co-produced the UK Beatbox Championships with a Fifth Element agency, so some of the best beatboxers in the world. And, the UK Beatbox Champs is a major international event where people from all over the world come fly over. There's Beatbox Championships in many of the kind of most countries around the world, in fact. But actually, the UK is still seen as a beacon of that. And so the Mexican Beatbox Championships came simply out of the knowledge of running something so complex and so particular about a community. And so going back to your question about, you know, what's the cheat sheet and what would you, you know, what tips there are. One is, you know, recognizing and bowing down to the culture and not making any assumptions that what you know is best, because that can come across arrogance and kind of colonialism and, you know, all the stuff. You know, you've got to be careful when you're working with British Council as well, the optics of that. And that's really important to me because I'm an anti-colonialist and, you know, I had, you know, kind of reservations of how I might work with an organisation like that, but I'm happy to say, like, I work with them very comfortably now. You know, I kind of reconciled the conflict and the challenges and realised the benefits to it. So part of it is about the assumptions that you make about other cultures. Another is, you know, working within different banking systems is, as I'm sure you're aware, like is difficult, you know, IBAN numbers and different like Swift and all of these things. And basically, like, if you think you're going to get paid, you will get paid, but it's a lot longer. And if you think you're going to get paid like within 28 days and you're working with like Mexico or Venezuela or something, then they don't have those legal frameworks. So you kind of have to think about that, you know, when you're thinking about your cash flow, when you're thinking about how you pay, you know, subcontractors or facilitators or event producers that are working on the ground and that. So yeah, ultimately it's just about respect and not assuming that a lot of us can fall into that, like, because, you know, we're from London, we're from the UK, a lot of people around the world look to us, you know. I will go to a lot of places and people be like, oh my God, you're from London. Like, this is the home of popular music over basically a century. And it's easy to get gassed up by that. But actually, you know, if you go to Cuba, for example, just because they don't have the biggest music, let's be clear, like, Cuba has one of the best music industries in the world. But the problem with Cuba is that it's all centralized because obviously it's a communist country. So the government basically runs the main record label, which is called IGREM. So if you want to like get an artist onto a record label, or if you want to like book an artist to come overseas, come to the UK or Europe, you have to go through the government, and the government will have their own priorities. And that's a bit of a madness. So, you know, but at the same time, their musicians, like, you know, crap on all of our musicians. Like, they're some of the best jazz musicians in the world, and they are playing with the resources that they have because the resources aren't easy to come by in Cuba. So you have like this kind of refinement of this talent and this skill, and like to this point where, frankly, musically, they know best. Can they learn some things about kind of industry and kind of artist rights and so on? Yeah, potentially. But, you know, it's always a push and pull when you're working internationally.
Those are some fire gems. Fire gems. Yeah. Aaliyah, someone who is building up your creative career, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Dan is someone who I've worked with. He sharpened my tools. I'm learning from him. We're all learning from him. What kind of questions do you have?
Well, you briefly touched on the media earlier. I wanted to know, like, how has the sort of shift in media, this sort of new era of digitalization, how has that helped, hindered your sort of individual career progression? How has that sort of changed your move from a more national to a global scale of things? You know, what was it like post-pandemic, and what are your predictions for the future?
Nice. Yeah, I mean, we're an interesting example because, like, you know, Lyrix Organix started in 2009, which was around the kind of where Facebook was starting to become popular. And so we kind of rode that wave of no algorithms. I want to invite 300 of the people I know in my life to an event, and I can invite 300 people I know to an event. Not like today, you invite 300 people and maybe 3 of them see it. You get me? So that was a major plus in how we came up on a budget, basically, as a grassroots organization. As things have evolved, you know, that was, you know, kind of still MySpace times, you know, I was still connecting and booking a lot of artists through MySpace. And so it was still a new kind of form of communication, and certainly wasn't necessarily something that people had understood how to commoditize or generate revenue from. Obviously, since then, especially with the rise of YouTube, you know, I remember initially, I'm showing my age now, like, I remember like when YouTube was coming about, like musicians were really reluctant to put their music on there. And now obviously, you know, you'd be stupid not to put stuff on there because it's a channel, it's an avenue that people discover you by. So I guess one of the major changes is simply how artists have harnessed it. Like I've literally just seen it from the dawn of social media through to, you know, this kind of inherent expertise, this kind of native Gen Z, Gen A kind of application of media that becomes intrinsic into everything that they do. And I think the culmination of that at the moment is clearly TikTok, whereby people create content which is almost entirely separate from their kind of persona or their kind of brand in a way, which all feeds back into their brand. And so I guess the big change has been the artist's understanding and the empowerment through media, whereas before, frankly, artists were the kind of the butt of media, like they would be touched or picked up by media if media wanted it, and now it's the other way around. And I think that's really important. I think going forward, and speaking to what you mentioned about international, yeah, we do think internationally now. We recognize that we have an international audience, and that helps things in so much as it opens our mind that sometimes, you know, especially now with a lot of stuff going around in the political game and with the kind of Tory, possibly incoming Labour government and all the complexities and also the very simple facts of it as well, means that people are interested in, from the outside looking in, into domestic politics and social issues and socioeconomic issues. And likewise, you know, we look to other countries and find out things that we never really thought we might knew unless we read something like FT or kind of higher brow newspapers, which would serve international news. So I think it's given us more of a responsibility to tell the story of what happens here. And I think a lot of people are looking to the UK, especially post-Brexit. I think there's something that was obviously hugely damaging and hugely, especially to the music industry, if you think about touring on a basic level in Europe, on the most basic of levels, something that was on our doorstep that suddenly just cut off a massive income stream for loads of my friends. Like, you know, they would lose thousands and thousands of pounds a year and huge amount of audiences because they can't afford the carnets to luggage there to transport their equipment around. So suddenly they can't tour because they can't afford to bring their equipment around. So what ends up happening is that they have to employ local musicians to be their touring band and so on. So whilst that might not be about media, it does, you know, kind of post-Brexit reflect this change in the way that artists have to work and the kind of the media optics of that. But going forward, I think media is an interesting one. Like, I feel like there's more space for artists to take. I think there's a greater realization, perhaps. Maybe you guys might have some insight into it, because, you know, it feels very much like an evolving space whereby, and not just artists, creatives, entrepreneurs, subjects in general, have greater power and greater influence, and to the point where we as creative communities and entrepreneurs have the power to dictate the narrative now. If you think about what's happening in Palestine at the moment, like, I would like to think, for all of the stuff that's going on where many of us are feeling unheard, that we wouldn't be having humanitarian corridors today. We wouldn't be having a kind of a scrutiny of what's happening in Gaza if it wasn't for the media, and specifically the creative, the political, the communities who have struggled to find a voice otherwise. And I think that previously there was perhaps a propensity, like a habit of media to control that narrative. But because that has been disempowered to an extent, what you're seeing is that kind of knock-on effect in major things like Brexit and Palestine and things where we can speak now and people got to listen.
Yeah. I want to get into the sort of social justice aspect of your work, but before that, what is the top sort of piece of advice you'd give to young people? How do you suggest they should use the media to sort of utilise themselves, to immerse themselves into this sort of music, live events sort of industry?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's a question I get a lot, and it's a challenge because it depends very much on the individual. And actually, one of the especially when we're running, like youth workshops, whether it's music business or entrepreneurship or social leadership, and inevitably the question is, right, I want to do this thing. What's my digital strategy going to be? The first point of call is, well, how comfortable do you feel with digital? Because there's a lot of pressure to, be posting 3, 4, 5 times a week, creating loads of content, whereas actually there's a lot of people who don't feel comfortable doing that. And I think one of the major pieces of advice is to do what you're comfortable with, because people will feel that. If you're like overstretching because you're like, you feel like you've got to do 4 posts a week and like you have struggled doing one, then you need to factor that into your business strategy. Like, do you need to pay someone to do that? What's the kind of content that you can do comfortably where you don't feel like you're selling yourself too hard? So for me, it's kind of like, I study psychology at university. So like for me, part of it is about just being like psychologically happy with media and what you're prepared to share and what you're prepared not to share, and to plot that out from quite early, because I didn't do that. And I kind of evolved with digital media and found myself in places where I was like, do you know what? Like, actually, I'm getting really stressed by having to run my own business and doing 4 or 5 posts a week, because that's not me. And so eventually I feel like I was able to spend more time on my business in a better way and to amplify the digital side of things better when I trusted it to people who cared more about it.
Mm-hmm. So you sort of worked with the likes of like Lowkey, Akala, and I like their sort of niche of sort of lyrical activism.
Yeah.
I would say. So how do you sort of see this intersection between like rap, poetry, music as a powerful tool in terms of navigating social justice? And like, what has your work in Lyrix Organix, how has that sort of played out in those regards?
Yeah, so we started Lyrix Organix for that specific reason. So when we started in 2009, it was around the realization that I was going to gigs, and I was going to gigs like 5, 6 nights a week, and I just wanted something more. I wanted to feel like if I was to put on another event brand, that it was actually contributing to the conversation. At the time, and still, I love hip hop, I love spoken word, and I love folk music. And to me, they're very much intricately linked, because all of them are a folk music. They are language of a disenfranchised communities, and often they would sing or rap because they weren't being heard in political discourse or just simply dialogue. Like, if I was, British Chinese person, or if I was Afro-Caribbean, like if I was to stand up in the middle of the room and say my political opinions, it would maybe seen as less than. But if I can commit that to an artistic body of work, people will listen. It's kind of about the vehicle of the message, really. And so when we started, we realized if we could intersect quality performance with meaningful words and present it in a space which kind of democratized that space. And we did that by making all our events charity events, and not just any charity events. We worked with MSF, Doctors Without Borders, because we recognized that they donated about 85% of their donations to the front line, which is very different from the majority of other charities, that we were contributing to them meaningfully. And bringing that kind of, creating that space for those kind of 3 cornerstones. And so what that manifested at was ultimately, who do I rate? Like, you know, we actually just next door at Rich Mix was where we did our first show with Akala, which was in 2010. And he was doing the Hip Hop Shakespeare Company, which was, you know, visionary. And that came from him approaching us and being like, I really see what you're doing. Can we do this thing together? Now, obviously, fast forward, whatever, 13, 14 years, and the idea of Akala coming to you with a show idea, be like, definitely. At the time, he wasn't huge, but he was still academic. You could hear it in his lyrics, you know, it was, yeah, his brain preceded the academic self, I think, and you could hear it in his music. And so working with artists like Lowkey and Akala and Koji and K Tempest, you know, have been a real inspiration, and it feels like a really reciprocal thing. And quite frankly, I feel humbled by the fact that, you know, K Tempest approached us for the Brighton Festival, which is really prestigious. She was the guest director. Sorry, they were the guest director, and were like, really rate what you're doing. We want to give back. And so, yeah, it's really important. And also, I should say, in 2023, the reason we did it was because, you know, if you can cast your mind back to 2009, talking about like early days of Tiny Temper, Tinchy Strider, like Professor Green, like all sick rappers, but they weren't saying a lot, right? Professor Green a little bit, but they weren't saying much that was kind of about social issues because record labels weren't signing them. But these record labels were putting them to the front, making them number one. But that's why grime just dissolved, because once people got sick of the fads, it all disintegrated. Now, fortunately, with grime, like, it had enough of a foundation to grow itself again. But when we started Lyrix Organix in 2009, in that context, we were like, imagine if in the pop charts you had artists who were actually saying stuff, right? Imagine if you had in the UK charts like Nas's and Killer Mike's and people who were really like changing a narrative politically and socially in the UK pop charts. We believed that, but we weren't ever sure that was going to happen. And now you have your Stormzy's as a brilliant case study, where you can't have an artist, rapper, well, I mean, you can, but there is an added value to a social justice element to a rapper, at least now. You think about George the Poet as well, Sophia Thakur. It's amazing to see how that social justice element has become such an important part of the content.
Yeah,
and I love that.
Yeah. And I think something at the forefront of all of this is the obvious issue of like sort of the diversification of the music industry.
Yeah.
So sort of, have you seen any improvements in your career timeline working on this issue? And what are you currently working on now to sort of help improve this? Because obviously it has improved a lot just by your individual work of, like you're saying, bridging the gaps. But I think there's obviously still a long way to go. So how do you sort of envision that?
There's so far to go. I think Black Lives Matter as a kind of milestone brought a reckoning, which made a huge difference for sure. And we're still feeling the positive repercussions of that. And God willing, we will continue to forever. But in reality, a lot of what has happened is tokenism. When we talk about big corporate organizations, because they had to be seen to be doing something. And don't get me wrong, that is the first step in change. Like that kind of peer pressure, if you like, that people have to change, whether the rationale behind that is commercial or whether it's community-based or charity, whatever, it still leads to the same point. So that's really important. At the moment, we are, myself and an academic called Kate McBain, are co-leading a major piece of consultation for Youth Music, who are one of the major funding bodies for music in the UK for young people, to see how we can do better, because there's a recognition that there's a disconnect between the music industry and music education. So, as you all know, Beach, like, you went to the Roundhouse making music when you were young.
Yeah.
Like, these are incredible organizations. But it's only now that the Roundhouse has had the opportunity to be like, oh, actually, what happens next? Like, after they finish making music, how do they earn money? And how do they get into the industry? And if you think about most youth clubs, youth services, arts organizations that have music programs, a lot of them, for fairly obvious reasons, are populated by people who have less opportunity, right? Marginalized communities. And it may be because funding cuts in the arts and schools means that people who like producing music or beatboxing or whatever aren't served at school. Or you have funding cuts of youth centres, so people don't have places to go. And ultimately, what is happening is there is a massive systemic issue at play, which is, even though the intention might be there to bring in people from less advantaged backgrounds traditionally, actually, there's not a whole lot changing. And the reality is there's things like, if you want to enter the music industry or the creative industries, you're going to need a bit of backing, because you're going to have to take, let's say, 3 days out of your working week. Like, how are you going to pay your rent, right? So there's basic fundamentals like that, which means that you have a whole echelon of society that's just dropped, because most people can't afford to take 3 days out of a week to make music, which may one day make money. And so, yes, things are changing, and yes, things are good, but there's so much more that can be done. And I think there's huge systemic issues, which we will identify literally in the next few weeks and months, which I'm really excited about. It basically means we're going to go around the country, interview loads of young creators, loads of youth leaders, organizations, music industry, and be like, let's reimagine this. Yeah. So let's see what happens.
That's important. Even at the charity that I run, we've just been given some funding to build a new youth club, and rather than just going, boom, here's a new youth club, like, let's do some periods of consultation. Let's get the young people to co-create and think about what the branding look like, what it feels like. Let's go see what provisions are existing right now, because it's all good to read in the headline and saying there's nothing there. There are little things still there.
Yeah.
But what's going wrong? You know? So that's very, very, very important. And whenever the thing is out, we can update the bio of this YouTube channel so people can go back and read it and look at that. Dan, it has been a pleasure.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you.
I have been your boy Beej.
I'm your boy Seb.
I'm Aaliyah.
I've been Dan.
And this is another episode of Blocks to Bags.